Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I bought my house, I thought I was leaving chaos behind. No HOA, no rules, just peace. 2 weeks later, a mysterious fine appeared on my doorstep, and with it, a war I never asked for. What began with a van in my driveway unraveled a web of fraud, control, and suburban espionage. 2 weeks after moving into my new house on Sycamore Bend Road, on one of those muggy North Carolina afternoons when the air feels heavy enough to chew on, I found a thick cream-colored envelope wedged under my door. No postage, no delivery sticker, just the HOA's logo embossed across the front like a smug little badge of authority. I had been unpacking kitchen boxes and wondering where the hell my coffee grinder ended up, so I was already irritated. This envelope didn't help. I opened it expecting one of those "Welcome to the Neighborhood" brochures or maybe a reminder to join some community mailing list. Instead, the first line punched me in the face with bureaucratic confidence. You are in violation of Rule 14.7, improper storage of oversized vehicles. I stared at the page, then at the driveway where my silver work van sat in. Full undeniably visible glory. The letter went on to declare that I owed $850 in fines and that penalties would accrue daily if I failed to comply. The HOA also helpfully included a low-resolution photograph of my own damn van, taken from a distance so dramatic it looked like surveillance footage from a nature documentary about invasive species. At first, I actually laughed. Not a joyful laugh, more like a bewildered bark of disbelief. I had never received a single sheet of HOA paperwork when I bought the place. The house had been a foreclosure sale, the kind banks love to treat like an unwrinkled fresh start. My purchase agreement mentioned absolutely nothing about mandatory membership, bylaws, covenants, rules, guidelines, or any other HOA-flavored nonsense. I bought the property outright, fair and square, and I knew how to read contracts. My entire professional life revolved around tearing apart sloppy clauses and mislabeled exhibits. If there was a leash attached to this house, I would have seen it before signing. But still, the tone of the letter was so unapologetically authoritative that a tiny unwelcome thought crept in. What if I missed something? So, I brewed myself a cup of aggressively strong coffee, sat at my dining table, which at that point was just a folding table with one mismatched chair, and went through the contract again, line by line. Nothing, not a whisper of HOA involvement. I even checked the deed. Same story. Absolutely nothing tying me to Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. So, being the reasonable adult that I am, most days, I wrote a short, polite email to the address listed on the notice. I explained I was not a member, asked them to provide any documents showing otherwise, and requested copies of their bylaws and recorded covenants. I clicked send and expected this misunderstanding to evaporate within a day. It took them half of one morning. By noon the following day, I had a second envelope shoved into my mailbox. This one was thicker, angrier, and laminated in the sense that everything inside was wrapped in fluorescent red highlighting, like someone had attacked the documents with a highlighter while caffeinated and resentful. Inside was a new notice. The fine had magically transformed into $1,200, and I was informed that my failure to pay constituted intentional non-compliance. They also threatened to pursue all available legal remedies, which is HOA speak, for we like to pretend we're a local government. This time, I didn't laugh. Instead, I walked outside and surveyed the street. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was truly off. Literally. There was a small wooden sign on the corner that read, Willow Creek Estates, a deed-restricted community, except the address numbers on the sign didn't match the ones on my deed. My property was carved just outside the original development map. Close enough to be a neighbor, but legally a free agent. A wild card, not theirs. I went back inside, fired up my laptop, and pulled county parcel records just to be absolutely certain. My lot was listed as non-HOA parcel. No governing covenants. The kind of classification even a rookie title clerk could understand. With that certainty in hand, I drafted a formal letter of my own. Short, neat, professional, exactly the tone that makes bureaucrats sweat behind the knees. I told them any continued attempts to impose fines or assert authority would be considered unlawful, and that they were to cease contact until they produced legally valid documentation. I was feeling pretty satisfied with myself, imagining the moment they realized they'd barked up the wrong tree. But then, That evening, as I was unloading tools from my van, a woman I'd never seen before marched briskly down the sidewalk toward my driveway. She wore the kind of expression typical of people who think community standards are more important than the Constitution. She had a clipboard tucked under her arm and a name badge clipped to her blouse. Karen B., HOA president. Of course, her name was Karen. "Mr. Milton?" she called out, her tone carrying the unmistakable pitch of someone used to being obeyed. "That's me," I said, locking the van. "I assume you've received your notices," she said. "Not a question, more like a diagnosis." "I have, and I assume you've received my response," I said. She allowed herself a thin, almost polite smile. "Your response was noted. Unfortunately, it does not change the fact that your vehicle is in violation of Rule 14.7. Oversized vehicles may not be stored in visible locations. We expect full compliance." "You keep saying we," I replied. "But I'm not part of your we. My property is an HOA governed." Her eyebrows lifted a fraction as if she'd heard a child proudly declare that gravity didn't apply to them. "Every home in this neighborhood is under the association's jurisdiction." "Not mine," I said. "County records disagree with you." She tilted her head, studying me. "Well, Mr. Milton, perhaps you should double-check those records. And in the meantime, I strongly suggest you begin making arrangements to relocate your vehicle to an appropriate storage facility. Daily penalties are already accruing." It took visible effort not to laugh again. This time, it wouldn't have been amused. More along the lines of, "Are you out of your mind?" "Have a good evening, Ms. B.," I said, walking back toward the house. She didn't leave immediately. I saw her stand beside my driveway, writing something aggressively on her clipboard before marching off, heels clacking like a judge's gavel. When I closed the door behind me, a simple thought settled in the back of my mind like an approaching thunderstorm. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a fight, and I had no idea just how deep this HOA's rabbit hole went. 3 days after Karen marched down my driveway with her clipboard of doom, I received what the HOA no doubt considered a decisive rebuttal: a manila envelope stamped urgent member compliance file. The word member alone was enough to make my eye twitch. Someone had tucked the packet into my screen door early in the morning. No knock, no doorbell, just bureaucratic stealth. I brought it inside, still in my pajamas, and spread it open across the table. The first sheet claimed to be a voluntary membership agreement signed by the property's previous owner. The signature was bold, looping, and confidently written. The problem: the man who supposedly signed it had been dead for 2 full months on that date. Dead men might tell no tales, but apparently they did join HOAs. I took a breath and looked at the signature again, comparing it with the signature on the original deed I had scanned. Same name, completely different handwriting. The HOA either believed I was an idiot or hoped I wouldn't bother checking the public record. Both were insultingly optimistic. The membership agreement lacked a notary seal, a witness signature, and any evidence it had ever been recorded with the county. It even referenced a lot number that didn't match mine. They had swapped it out later with a different parcel ID in different ink, like someone trying to forge a permission slip 5 minutes before the school bus arrived. It only got better. Behind the fake agreement was a copy of official public hearing minutes. According to this document, some grand community meeting had taken place 2 months before my arrival, where residents had allegedly voted to incorporate bordering properties to preserve aesthetic continuity. 14 residents attended, names, addresses, the whole shebang. Except 3 of the listed addresses belonged to vacant homes, 2 to Airbnbs, and 1 to someone I'd met at the local hardware store, who told me he hadn't been to an HOA meeting in over 3 years because he'd rather drink bleach than listen to Karen talk about mulch. They had even assigned me an empty folding chair in the attendance list, which I had never occupied because I had been living in a different city at the time. If Karen was going to fabricate history, she could at least try to make it historically consistent. I stared at the minutes, then at the seal printed at the top. It looked official, but something about it was off. Too crisp, too centered. And when I zoomed in with my phone camera, the seal had pixelated edges, like it had been dragged from a clip art folder, last updated in the late 90s. These documents weren't sloppy, they were lazy. And that alone made them dangerous. Lazy frauds often overplay their hand. I decided to verify my suspicions the old-fashioned way. I drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a beard that looked like it had survived 2 marriages and a tax audit, searched every database available. Nothing. No membership agreement had ever been filed. No hearing. No map updates. No amendments. The HOA's documents simply didn't exist in any legal capacity. When I mentioned the supposed meeting, the clerk actually laughed. "They love waving their little rules around," he said. "But they don't file half the crap they generate. If you're not in their map, you're not in their kingdom." Driving home, the absurdity of it all settled into something colder. This wasn't Karen being overzealous. This was a coordinated effort to rope in more properties, expand their fee base, and enforce authority where none existed. A lot of HOAs try small power grabs, but forging signatures of dead owners, fabricating public hearings, altering parcel IDs, that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a scheme. When I got home, I emailed a few neighbors whose names appeared on the meeting list. 2 replied within an hour. One had been visiting her sister in Georgia the entire week of the supposed meeting. The other told me she hadn't attended any HOA event since Obama's first term and had no clue why her name kept being used on official paperwork. She even forwarded me an old thread where she had confronted Karen about it. Karen claimed it was a clerical mistake. Of course it was. By nightfall, I had a small stack of evidence that the membership agreement was forged, the hearing never happened, and the HOA was being propped up by fraudulent paperwork. But one detail bothered me more than all the rest. The minutes were too polished. Someone had taken time to make them look credible. Fonts matched, margins lined up. There were timestamps, attendance checkboxes, motions proposed and seconded. This wasn't a sloppy afterthought, it was a template they'd used before, and that meant I wasn't the only one. I walked around my new house, taking in the quiet hum of the evening, and tried to imagine how many other residents had been snared by this paper trap. People who might have trusted the HOA or been too busy or overwhelmed to double-check the legitimacy of what they were told. People who might have paid thousands because Karen had slid a sheet of forged minutes under their door. By the time the sun dipped behind the pines, I had made up my mind. If they thought I would be easy prey, they had picked the wrong target. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to peel back every layer of this operation until daylight poured through the cracks. I didn't know exactly how far their scheme reached yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Karen hadn't just poked the wrong bear. She had poked a bear with a background in contract law, forensic auditing, and a very low tolerance for being fed bullshit. And I was only getting started. The next envelope didn't come with any warning, just like the others. No knock. No signature required. Just another passive-aggressive deposit of hostility stuffed into my mailbox like an unpaid parking ticket from hell. This one had a different tone, though. It wasn't a notice. It was a threat. Tucked inside was a 2-page letter from a local law firm, some boutique outfit called Camden and Finch, that sounded more like an artisanal jam company than legal counsel. The language was unmistakably aggressive. Failure to remit outstanding dues constitutes material breach. Legal action may be initiated. Liens may be sought against the property. They were trying to turn up the heat. The amount? Now it was $1,600. Apparently, my van had committed further acts of visual terrorism by merely existing within view of the street for 3 additional days. I imagined it standing there at night, whispering anti-HOA propaganda to passing joggers. The letter ended with a deadline, 72 hours to comply or face litigation. I didn't bite. Instead, I started cataloging. I built a spreadsheet. Document names, file dates, inconsistencies in parcel IDs, even the font mismatches in their PDFs. My desk turned into a crime board. Red ink, highlighters, folders. I started cross-referencing signatures from residents with other public records and found one particularly creative forgery that had a stroke pattern matching the HOA's secretary's handwriting from a newsletter 3 months prior. Sloppy. Recycled signatures, but things got uglier fast. That weekend, I noticed something new on the community bulletin board by the clubhouse, a laminated flyer with bold red letters, "Know your neighbors, compliance matters." Below the headline were several blurry photographs. One of them was my driveway. Another was my van. The caption, "Chronic violator refuses to comply with basic community standards." My name wasn't on it, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was a smear campaign. I took the flyer down. That same night, I got a knock on the door. It was an older man in his 60s, flannel shirt, white beard, the kind of guy who'd probably been sharpening his lawnmower blades since the Reagan administration. He introduced himself as Tom Lyle, house 2 doors down, and asked if we could talk. "I've lived here 22 years, he said, and this isn't the first time Karen's tried this." We sat on my porch with beers, and Tom told me everything. 4 years ago, she'd tried to absorb a cul-de-sac down the road by sending out unsigned mailers claiming a vote had occurred. 2 of the owners had hired lawyers. It fizzled out, but nothing ever went public. Karen was strategic, push where there's no resistance, back off when met with teeth. "She's expanding," Tom said. "Like a damn HOA cancer." I laughed. "So why doesn't anyone stop her?" "They try. But Karen's got control of the board, and the board controls the narrative, the newsletter, the budget, the mailings. They're all her mouthpieces. Most folks just don't have the time or energy to fight, or they're scared of getting fined to death." That hit harder than it should have. I'd assumed this was a one-time ambush. But Tom made it clear Karen had been testing the limits of her authority for years, and the neighborhood had let her, through silence, exhaustion, or fear. Later that week, I got a visit from a guy in a polo shirt with Sunrise Property Management stitched over the pocket. Said he was just doing some cleanup estimates. I hadn't requested anything. 10 minutes after he left, I spotted a shiny new plastic stake in my front yard, scheduled for landscape maintenance. HOA issued. I pulled the stake out and snapped it in half. The next morning, my mailbox had a sticky note. "Tampering with HOA contractor activities may result in additional fines. Cute." That same evening, I spotted something new, wedged into the hedges across the street from my porch. Small, black, lens forward. I walked over, picked it up. A trail camera, one of those motion-activated wildlife cams people use to spy on raccoons, except this one was pointed directly at my driveway, and it wasn't there the day before. I opened the compartment and found a micro SD card inside, still warm from the sun. There was also a small yellow sticker on the back. Property of WCEA, Willow Creek Estates Association. The bastards were surveilling me. I didn't touch the card. Too risky. Instead, I documented everything, photographed it in place, then photographed the serial number, sealed it in a Ziploc, and logged it in my now bursting evidence binder. I hadn't dealt with this level of passive-aggressive espionage since my audit days at a Fortune 500 telecom firm, and even they didn't plant cameras in the bushes. That night, I got a call from one of the neighbors I had emailed earlier, Sarah Kaplan. She'd found something. My name was listed on another meeting minutes file, she said. But I was in Chicago that weekend for my niece's graduation. I've got the flight confirmation. She sent me a copy. The minutes claimed she had seconded a motion to increase monthly dues. Another ghost vote. Another lie. It was becoming very clear this wasn't a rogue HOA. This was a rogue operation. One that relied on apathy and intimidation to keep people in line. But I wasn't in line. I was standing in the middle of the road with a bullhorn and a stack of receipts, and I had just begun to fight dirty. By now, the HOA had made one thing clear. They weren't going to stop. Not with logic, not with law, and sure as hell not with polite emails. So I stopped being polite. It was time to hit back. Most people underestimate the paper trail. They think documents just exist. They don't. They live, they breathe, they evolve, and they leave fingerprints. And when you've spent a decade gutting shady corporate mergers for a living, you start to see the threads. And this HOA had threads sticking out like a cheap suit. I filed 3 formal complaints that week. The first went to the North Carolina Secretary of State, requesting a full investigation into Willow Creek Estates Association's nonprofit status. I laid it out like a prosecutor. Fabricated minutes, forged signatures, inconsistent parcel inclusion, misuse of HOA seal. I attached screenshots, property records, and a map showing the geographic overreach of their so-called jurisdiction. The second complaint went to the Department of Consumer and Professional Services, detailing the association's harassment, false claims, and unauthorized surveillance. I included a full report on the trail camera I'd found, with photographs, timestamps, and even a notarized statement from my neighbor Tom confirming it hadn't been there the day before. And the third, that was personal. I created a website. I called it Willow Watch Clean, simple, neutral on the surface. A community resource for homeowners seeking clarity on their rights. I didn't post anything inflammatory, not yet. Instead, I built out a residence forum that looked like a genuine tool for neighborly discussion. HOA rules archive, discussion threads, anonymous complaint box, feedback polls. It was bait, and I knew exactly who would bite. Karen and her cronies logged in within 48 hours. I tracked the IPs, 3 of them traced back to devices assigned to the HOA office, 1 to the clubhouse Wi-Fi, and 1 to a lawyer's office in uptown Charlotte. The usernames were just as imaginative as I'd hoped: Admin Karen, President B, and, my personal favorite, Willow Truth Speaker. The real gold, though, was in the private messages. I'd set up the back end to log all data, including drafts. One of them, written by President B, was a half-finished note to another board member. If this guy thinks he can derail us with tech tricks, we'll remind him who owns the landscaping permits. Maybe it's time to vote on accelerated enforcement. Caught in real time. Another draft referred to me as a malicious disruptor and mentioned putting me on a community nuisance register, which, to my knowledge, wasn't even a real thing, but sounded exactly like the kind of fascist bullshit Karen would invent between Pilates and pretending to read bylaws. Meanwhile, Sarah Kaplan reached out again. She'd started going through her HOA payment history and found that 3 checks she'd written, each for monthly dues, had been cashed by an account under WCEA Services LLC, not the official nonprofit association. We both did some digging and found that WCEA Services LLC was a for-profit entity registered 6 months prior to my move, with Karen Berkeley listed as managing member. Boom. I posted a soft update to Willow Watch. No names, no drama. Just a question. Did your dues go to the HOA or to a private company? Within a day, 15 residents had messaged me. 7 said the same thing. They'd never noticed the name on the deposit slip. One even admitted he thought HOA just outsourced their banking now. What they'd done was more than unethical. It was textbook embezzlement, and it was only going to get better. I started compiling all these leads into a full dossier. I labeled it Operation Mulch Storm, part joke, part warning. Sarah laughed so hard when I told her she nearly snorted coffee through her nose. But even as things began to turn, Karen didn't slow down. One afternoon, I got home to find a city code inspector at my doorstep. Got a report about an illegal structure, he said, thumbing through a clipboard. What structure? I asked. He pointed to my garden shed. The one that's been here since 1995? He shrugged. Someone reported a modification. Complaint came from the HOA. I showed him the inspection sticker from 5 years ago. Still valid. He left 10 minutes later, mildly annoyed, muttering about neighborhood drama. That night, Karen posted on the official HOA website. Yes, they had one, and yes, it looked like it hadn't been updated since the Bush administration. The post warned residents about unregistered structures and individuals willfully refusing to comply with property ordinances. No names, of course, but everyone knew who she meant. And that's when I decided to drop the first real blow. I packaged my full dossier, evidence of forged agreements, false hearings, illegal LLC activity, unauthorized surveillance, embezzlement patterns, and sent it to a contact I had from my audit days who now worked for the State Board of Examiners for community associations. I also copied in a local investigative journalist who ran a newsletter called Watchdog Carolina. My message was short. You're going to want to see this, because the thing about people like Karen, they think everyone plays by the same rules. But some of us write them, and some of us know exactly where to find the loopholes they thought no one would notice. I wasn't surprised when the tone shifted from fake formality to thinly veiled malice. The more exposed Karen got, the sloppier her moves became. And desperate people, especially those with a clipboard complex, don't go down quietly. It started small. A passive-aggressive HOA newsletter article about increased vandalism of community equipment, complete with a blurry photo of someone who could, in the right lighting and with a head injury, be mistaken for me. Then came an anonymous letter slipped under my door. No return address, just typed lines that read, "Not everything has to be a war. People who disrupt community peace rarely find it themselves." Charming, but then it escalated. Monday morning, I opened my front door to get some air and coffee and noticed something strange sitting on the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the curb. A single black garbage bag, ripped, stuffed with what looked like broken tile and insulation foam. Construction debris. Not mine. I hauled it off to the edge of my driveway, took a few photos for my records, and assumed it was some contractor being lazy, until it happened again. And again. By the end of the week, 5 bags had appeared. Always early morning, always the same spot. On Friday, I came home and found a bright yellow citation taped to my front door, issued by the HOA. Violation: unauthorized dumping of building materials, non-compliance with Community Aesthetic Code 12.4b. Fine, $800. And they had photos, blurry but damning at a glance. The images showed me walking outside near the bags taken from across the street. I recognized the angle immediately. There was only one place that view could have come from: the shrubbery across from my house. I walked out and found it exactly where I expected. Another trail cam half buried behind the ornamental boxwoods. Same sticker, same placement, same surveillance signature as the last one. This time, I took it apart on the spot. The memory card was still inside. I brought it in, booted up a sandboxed laptop I used for audits, and pulled up the files. Dozens of stills, 1-second intervals. Most were of birds, dogs, passing joggers. But there, time-stamped 2 days earlier, was a short clip of a white pickup truck pulling up at dawn. The driver, a man in a hoodie, got out, dropped 2 bags of debris onto my curb, and left without ever stepping foot on my property. There was also a freeze frame where I stepped out minutes later in slippers and a bathrobe, scratching my head and sipping coffee. That was the image they used in their violation letter, cropped and captioned like I was the Unabomber of drywall scraps. That night, I printed the entire camera log, every single frame. I packaged it with the violation notice and dropped it off at the HOA office, addressed to Karen, with a post-it that read, "Might want to screen your subcontractors better. Surveillance can be a real bitch when it's accurate." I wasn't done. The next morning, I started going through the HOA's contractor records. I'd requested them weeks ago under their own transparency clause, which they had stupidly included in their bylaws to look accountable. The records listed a landscaping company, Greenrise Environmental, as the current maintenance provider for the neighborhood common areas. I ran a quick background check. Greenrise didn't exist. Not in the state database, not in the business license registry, not even on Yelp. What did exist was a recently dissolved LLC registered under the name of a man named Kyle Berkeley, Karen's nephew, 22 years old, and according to his Instagram, more into dirt bikes and crypto scams than actual landscaping. I published the whole thread to willowwatch.org. Public contracts, corporate documents, photos, timelines. I didn't accuse anyone directly, just asked a simple question. Are we paying for phantom contractors? The post exploded. Neighbors who had been silent began to message me, some angry, some afraid. One woman, Annette, mid-50s, soft-spoken, told me she'd received a fine for improperly trimmed hedges 3 months ago and had paid for a mandatory compliance trimming by HOA contractors. $120 for 15 minutes of noisy leaf blower chaos. Now she wasn't sure the trimming had even been necessary. By Sunday, I started getting emails from current and former board members. One in particular stood out. It came from a burner address, no name. The subject line was, "She forged my signature too." The body read, "I was the secretary until last year. I quit because Karen started adding names to minutes we never recorded. She made me sign things I knew weren't legal. When I refused, she said I was jeopardizing the uniformity of the community. I've kept copies of everything. If you're serious about this, I can help. But not publicly. Not yet." I stared at that message for a long time. It was the first crack from the inside. I replied with a burner account of my own, confirming I was serious, that I'd protect their anonymity, and that I wasn't looking to burn the neighborhood down, just clean it up. The next day, a padded envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Inside were scanned documents, minutes, notes, and a spreadsheet titled Projected Revenue, Voluntary Members. My name was on it, along with 10 others. Karen had a list, a plan, and I was just the first line item. I didn't sleep much after getting that envelope. There's a special kind of insomnia that kicks in when you know you're holding proof of someone else's criminal enterprise, and they're still walking around your neighborhood like they own the damn place. The spreadsheet titled Projected Revenue, Voluntary Members was laid out like a corporate forecast. Property addresses, estimated fines, dues projections, suggested compliance enhancements for increased enforcement. It read like a harvest schedule, and across the top, scribbled in red pen, was one word: targeted. Some names I recognized, others I didn't. But what really sealed it was that most of them, like me, were owners of homes on the outer edge of Willow Creek, the ones technically outside the association boundaries. She wasn't just enforcing fake rules, she was expanding her HOA empire one signature at a time, dead or alive. I needed more, so I reached back out to my new anonymous friend. We set up a secure line, voice only, late at night. She called herself Marcy, which I'm almost certain wasn't her real name. Her voice was cautious but steady. Said she used to be HOA secretary for 3 years, until things got weird. Claimed Karen started orchestrating community votes with no attendees, issuing minutes signed by people who hadn't been on the board in years, and funneling funds into side accounts labeled legal defense initiatives. She used to laugh, Marcy said. Said nobody reads the fine print, that if you make something look official enough, people just obey. I asked why she never reported it. I tried, went to one of the county clerks. He shrugged it off, said it was a civil matter. Then Karen called my husband's job pretending to be an anonymous neighbor, complaining about marital instability. Next day, he was pulled off a project. Jesus. This wasn't just fraud. This was psychological warfare dressed in khakis and pearls. Marcy agreed to meet. 1 hour, public place, back table at a bakery on the far end of town. She was nervous, kept her sunglasses on the whole time, spoke low, kept glancing at the door, like Karen might burst in with a cease and desist letter and a revolver full of citations. She slid me a USB stick. Inside, 7 PDFs. Originals of fake meeting minutes. One of them had her own signature, dated 3 weeks after she resigned. Everything's digital now, she said, but Karen insists on hard copies for optics. I scanned everything before I quit. Figured I might need an insurance policy someday. Marcy left quickly after that. I went home, ran checksums on the files to verify authenticity, and began integrating them into my now formal case folder, which I had started referring to as the cult file. Not because it was funny, though in a black comedy sense, it absolutely was, but because the behavior I was documenting mirrored that of a tiny suburban cult with weaponized bureaucracy and unchecked power. The next step was dangerous, but necessary. I filed a formal fraud complaint with the district attorney's office. Most people think DAs don't care about HOA drama. Usually they're right, but I wasn't coming in with just a complaint. I came with binders, diagrams, timelines, sworn witness statements, copies of forged documents, and a written declaration from Marcy. I laid it out like a RICO-light case. Fraud, falsification of public records, abuse of nonprofit status, and financial misrepresentation. The assistant DA who took my file was a guy named Reynolds, early 30s. Wore glasses too small for his head and had the kind of fast, clipped speech that said, "Burned out on felonies, hungry for something clean." I could see it in his eyes when he flipped through the folder. This wasn't just neighborly bickering. This was evidence. "I'll escalate this," he said, "but don't post anything new on your website for a few weeks. Can you do that?" I agreed. Barely. Because I had something cooking already. Something Karen wouldn't see coming. Remember that website I built? willowwatch.org? I turned one section into a form submission portal. Share your HOA experience. I kept it anonymous, encrypted, and safe. And that's when the floodgates opened. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 23 submissions. Some were simple: duplicate fines, unexplained dues hikes, repeated warnings over minor cosmetic violations. But others were serious. Accusations of retaliation, unapproved surveillance. Even one homeowner who claimed Karen had entered their backyard to inspect paint color compliance without notice or consent. But the real gem came from an elderly couple on Birch Hollow Lane. Their house had been added to the HOA last year, they said, without any explanation. When they objected, Karen had sent them a letter stating that per the recent community vote, their property was now officially under HOA oversight and subject to fees. No vote records were provided. They'd been paying ever since, out of fear. I cross-checked their parcel records. Just like mine, they were not part of the original HOA map. Another illegal inclusion, another voluntary member who had no idea they weren't legally bound. I reached out to them personally, brought them a copy of my report, explained what was happening. They cried, said they thought they were losing their minds. That was when I realized how much damage Karen had really done, not just financially, but psychologically. She'd weaponized people's trust, wrapped it in official-looking paper, and used it to bleed them dry. I wasn't just exposing fraud anymore. I was dismantling a machine, and I was almost ready to pull the plug. The storm hit on a Thursday morning when 4 county vehicles and a black Ford sedan pulled up outside the HOA office. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, camera rolling. I already knew why they were there. Assistant DA Reynolds had called the night before. Marcy's documents, my financial breakdown, and resident testimonies had pushed the investigation far enough for a full audit. At that point, the audit was just a formality. Karen arrived late in her Lexus, dressed like it was a normal workday. She smiled at the investigators until they served her with a subpoena. Through binoculars, I watched her expression melt from confusion to disbelief. She headed inside after arguing, and not once did I wave back. News spread quickly. The Willow Creek HOA was under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. Within hours, Willow Watch blew up with messages. Former residents, board members, even a contractor who'd been paid cash for fake consulting work tied to Karen's cousin. The audit exposed everything. Over 70% of the HOA's reserve, around $1.6 million, had been siphoned into bogus legal fees, consulting contracts, and community initiatives, all poorly documented. Hundreds of thousands went to vehicle leases and a fake beautification committee run by Karen's sister-in-law. There were fake hearings, forged documents, altered parcel maps, an HOA-sized Enron, just pettier. Karen's emails sealed it. She'd mapped out the entire scheme, from expansion plans to property targets. She even ordered staff to backdate agreements and reclassify lots for billing. A week later, she was arrested. Neighbors filmed as she was let out in handcuffs, still dressed like she was in charge. The charges stacked high: fraud, forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy, obstruction, wire fraud, misuse of nonprofit funds. Her arrest toppled everything. The board was dissolved, an interim administrator appointed, and fines against homeowners, including mine, were reversed. Some liens were cleared entirely. Reynolds told me the state wanted to pursue civil restitution using my evidence. I'd be eligible for $75,000. I accepted. The parcel list was amended. 18 properties, including mine, were officially declared outside HOA control. I'd won. After the arrest, the neighborhood felt lighter. People waved, even thanked me. The HOA office sign disappeared, replaced by a for sale notice. The building was being liquidated to pay damages. Karen's empire was collapsing. And every morning since, I parked my van proudly in my driveway, in full view. No citations, no warnings, just silence. The kind that means freedom. I never expected a sign to feel like closure, but there it was on the fence where the HOA office had been. For sale, commercial property. No HOA. I sipped from my travel mug while a couple peeked through the sealed, empty building. Karen's once perfect flower bed was now a patch of weeds. Fitting. Walking home, I passed my van sitting proudly in the driveway, a monument of defiance. I'd even carved a wooden sign for my fence. Not part of any HOA. I don't pay for fiction. And I don't take threats. Subtlety was long gone. The interim administrator had visited earlier, inviting residents to a simple, drama-free community meeting. I went. People showed up. Tom in his flannel, Sarah with cupcakes, Annette asking if they could dissolve the HOA entirely. The applause said everything. A week later, the vote made it official. Willow Creek Estates HOA was gone. I framed the court order beside the photo of Karen being taken away. She was later convicted. 14 years, asset forfeiture, restitution, public apologies. Others got fines or community service. Some quietly moved away. Meanwhile, my consulting business grew. Thanks to referrals from people who once saw me as trouble. I added motion lights out of old habit, but the neighborhood finally felt lighter. No warnings, no forged documents, just normal life. One afternoon, sitting beside my van, I watched kids ride freely and neighbors wave without fear or agendas. For the first time since moving here, I didn't feel targeted. I felt like a homeowner, a free one.